Hello and welcome back. I'm Erica with Revival Threadworks, and today we're going to be making this Hexi shopper tote. Now this tutorial is a little bit lengthy, as some of my tutorials tend to be, but that's because I like to show you every single step that you need to take, and I give you a little bit of tips and helpful things along the way. So we're going to be using a fat quarter bundle for this project, but we use fat quarters on the straps. There's 5 different fat quarters in the Hexis, and then on the inside we use 2 fat quarters, and we cut them in half so that way the bottom is all the same and the top is all the same. So I hope that you join me, and I hope that you enjoy making your tote. So let's get started. Now this tote can be used for, grocery shopping in lieu of a plastic bag. You can put your books in there. You can put your probably even your laptop in there if you have a laptop that'll fit. In fact, I think my laptop would fit at least this way. But I made this project using a fat quarter bundle. So I recently purchased this Zinnias by Lila Tuller to Riley Blake Designs fat quarter bundle. And I went ahead and pulled out the fabrics for the Hexis for this. I used, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different prints for the Hexis. And all I did is just kind of cut some pieces, from the fat quarter bundle to make my little Hexis with. And then I also used, we'll use 2 fat quarters for the interior lining side, and then a fat quarter to cover the straps. So in total I use, let's see, 5, 6, 7, 8 fat quarters, but I have quite a bit of fabric left over on these. And then I also chose a solid color for this. So with that being said, let's kind of talk about how this fabric gets laid out. So as you can see, I've got black fabric. Now, the reason why I chose black fabric is because the Hexis really stand out well on the black. I discovered that with my little Bible cover that I did last week, and I really like the way that looks. So these are not fat quarters. However, it's based on the size of a fat quarter. So as we all know, when we get a fat quarter from a factory bundle or whatever, it's usually cut a little bit irregularly. So what I did is I squared up my fat quarters, figured out what my usable space was, and that's what this size is. Okay, so it's 17.5 inches by 20.5 inches. So I've got 2 pieces of black fabric, 70.5, or not 70, 17.5 by 20.5. So there's 2 pieces for this is for the front. Like I said, I chose black. You can choose whatever you want. And then for the interior of the bag, I chose 2 separate fat quarters. Now, if you'll notice, they're cut in half. Okay. The reason why I did this, now this is a technique that I use myself. I don't know if you like it. If you don't, I just kind of figured this out. So when I get a fat quarter bundle, inevitably there are prints inside there that I am not in love with. So I always try to find a way to use those pieces in a way that uses them, but yet doesn't make that print or that color a feature. So I'm using them for the interior of my bag. Now, the reason why I cut them in half is for this reason. So if I were to use them as a liner, and I use one for this side and one for that side, then when I open up my bag, I'm going to have one color on this side, one color on that side. Now that's, if that's what you like, that's perfectly wonderful and perfectly fine for you. But what I did is I cut these in half the short way, and I'm going to join them like this. And then I'll figure out which side I want on the top. That way the top of my bag, when I'm looking down into my bag, has the same print on the top, and then the bottom has the same print, but yet it still uses up these fat quarters that I am not absolutely in love with. So here's 2 more fat quarters. So again, this is 1 fat quarter, 2 fat quarters, and then we're going to cover our straps. So we've got 2 seatbelt straps that are approximately 28 to 30 inches, and I say approximately because it's all going to depend on the size that you want on your bag. And as usual, and same with my other videos, I always use leftover strapping that I have from other projects, because I'm going to cover this up with fabric, so I don't care what these look like, and the fabric isn't light colored, so it's not going to matter. And then I took another fat quarter and I cut 1, 2, 3 strips of 2 3/4 by the length of the fat quarter, which is again about 20.5 usable inches. So there's 3 of these, and we're going to join them together, put these all in it. So these are for the straps. And then the Hexis are made with 5 different prints. Now, this here is a total of 20 Hexis, I think, 20 or 21 Hexis for the front. And I'm going to do the same pattern on the back of my bag. So the front of my bag and the back of my bag are going to look the same. So all I did is just cut out some strips from my fat quarters at the end, used my little hexagon ruler that I got off of Amazon, cut some, hexagons, and then I took my 1-inch papers and I made my Hexis. Now I'll show you in just a minute how to do that with the sew method. But I made 40, I don't know, actually I think I made closer to 60 Hexis for this project, but I think we're only going to use about 40. And then you're also going to want to have some batting. Now this is a product that I have been using recently because I bought it at Joann when they were going out of business, and this is what it's called. It's called Polyfill, or it's by Polyfill. It's called Project Fleece. You can use it for quilt batting, garment liners, crafts, whatever. It's a polyester batting, so I don't want to use up my good cotton batting on projects like these. That's why I'm using this, and I have quite a bit of it from, like I said, when Joann closed. So your batting pieces are going to be about 1 inch bigger than these pieces. So if these pieces are 17.5 by 20.5, your batting pieces are going to be 18.5 by 21.5. And I did 2 because I do plan on quilting both the front and the back of my bag. So next thing you're going to need is some pins, some clips just in case. And I'm going to suggest that you have a Hera marker, but we're going to talk about that, maybe not being able to use that in just a minute. You're going to need a needle and thread, scissors, chalk marker. Now again, this is what I'm talking about. You may want to use a chalk marker. You may want to use a Hera marker. We'll discuss that in a minute. You're going to need a template for your hexagon, which is the one that I found on Amazon. Now, this is the size of my template, or this is the size of my paper. So it's a 1-inch paper. Now, when I was making these, I did some that were in the smaller size that only give 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and they were so hard to sew together. I hated it, hated it. So I ended up cutting my pieces bigger and did a whole lot more this way. So I would suggest that you do, if you're doing a 1-inch hexagon, that you use the 1 1/4 inch template to cut your pieces out of. Then a ruler, just various tools like that. So the first thing that I want to do is show you how to make Hexis. Now when I made my Bible cover last week, or when I did the video on the Bible cover, I did not show you how to make a Hexi because I just kind of assumed that everybody, except for me, of course, because I just learned, knew how to do a Hexi. But I wanted to go ahead and show you real quick on camera how to actually make a Hexi. Now I hope I have enough thread in here, but the first time that I made Hexis, I used the glue method, and I just glue basted the edges of my Hexis. Well, what ended up happening is when it came time to pull the paper out, they ended up getting stuck, and then I ended up tearing a lot of my papers. So what you want to do, what I would recommend that you do, is sew them. Just baste them with a little bit of needle and thread. I think that it ended up being a whole lot easier. And so I'm going to show you that real quick. So this is my 1-inch hexagon paper. This is my template for 1 1/4. Okay. So if I were to use the template that's supposed to go with this hexagon paper, my fabric would only be going up to these lines here. And like I said, I ended up not liking that whatsoever. So I ended up cutting mine a little bit bigger. So you're going to take your paper and just kind of evenly, hold it in there. Fold over your first edge, pinch it, fold over your second edge and pinch that. Then you're going to take your needle and thread and just sew that together. You have a knot at the end of your thread, hopefully. And then just pull it until that knot catches. And then you're going to keep pinching and scooting all the way around. Now, as I said, I have literally just discovered the hexagon world, so I might be doing this incorrectly for other people. I don't know if I'm doing this, the way that others would suggest, the professionals would suggest, but for me, this ended up being a way that was just super easy for me. Like I said, I sat down and did about 40 of them, in one little evening while I was watching a show, and they ended up being just fine. So then when I get to the very end, which is this last little fold here, I'm going to attach this last, or actually second to the last one. And now I'm going to go to this very last one, secure my end there, and then I'm going to take it one more time through. So hopefully you can see that just one more time, just through the little edge there. I'm going to take my thread, kind of twist it, wrap it around, oop, hopefully over that needle, hopefully I have enough. That way it kind of just ties it off a little bit, and then I'm going to pull it. It cinches down just like that. And then I'm going to clip this off. Now, because this hasn't been glued, it's going to be a lot easier to get that paper out of there. So here's what I did with mine. Now again, I am not a professional, so I don't know if everybody else does with their Hexis, but I happen to really like nice firm creases. So I took all of my Hexis and I ironed them. So I just put them on the ironing board, pressed them all flat like that before I took my papers out. Once I pressed them flat, then I just popped my paper out just like that. And then I pressed them one more time so that they are nice and flat. They are quite literally super flat. Okay. So you're going to want to make, like I said, 40 to 50, depending on how many you want, or even less than that. If you decide that you only want hexagons on the front, then don't do that. Anyway, once you have all your hexagons done, the first thing that we're going to do is quilt the front. Okay, so now it's time to show you how to line this all up. Now, in my tests, I used the chalk pen, which is, actually, I think I must have moved. Well, no, it's right over here. Which is this, which is just something I bought off of Amazon. Like I said, I used white on my test, but I did this. I started trying to line this all up, and what ended up happening is because the chalk flattens a little bit, my spacing got off just a bit. And you know, when you're working with geometry just like this, it was my intention to do triangles across the whole thing, and it just didn't come out right. So it's been a whole week since I actually started filming this because I got so frustrated with laying this all out that I just didn't know how I was going to do it, how I wanted to do it. So I have now come back a whole week later, and I think I have figured out the best way to get this laid out. So in my prior section here just a minute ago, I think I said that we were going to box the corners. If I didn't, I'm sorry, I'm just going to repeat myself here. But we're going to do 3.5 inch boxed corners. So I've got a mark at the 3.5 inch mark here, and we're going to start laying out our hexes at the 5.5 inch mark. So what we're going to do is make your little marks on each side 5.5 inches up. And then we're just going to take a Hera marker, which I know this is, I said to use a chalk marker if you have a dark fabric, but because that chalk tends to flatten out a little bit, I figured that if we use the Hera marker, we will be able to see it a little bit better. So hopefully you can see it. Anyway, and then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to make a halfway mark down here, a halfway mark here, and then we're going to put another mark with the Hera marker right down the center. So I've already done that in my little tests here. So I've got a center mark, and then I've got a mark 5.5 inches up from the bottom. So what we're going to do is we're going to start placing these hexes. Now, I also tried a couple of different methods to place the hexes to where they wouldn't move very much. One of those methods was using heat and bond light. And to be honest with you, I think it would end up being a little bit more of a mess and a little bit more trouble than I think it's worth, although I do think it's a good method. But you would end up having to heat and bond everything to the back of these, then trim out around them. And I just think that that might be a bit of a time-consuming method. So I'm just going to recommend that you get a little bit of fabric glue. This is just a clear fabric glue by Aleene's. And what we're going to do is choose our centerpiece. So this 5.5 inch line, this is where we're going to start putting things along the bottom. This is the row that we're going to create. And then this center mark is where we're going to put the first one here. So we are actually going to figure out, so let's see, We want to go 3 rows up, and then these are going to be placed here on the bottom. Actually, you know what? Never mind. This is the mark that the point's going to go. So I'm sorry. I'm just kind of winging it here. I apologize. So we're going to take these points here, this point and this point, make sure that they line up on that center line, and then make sure that this point lines up on that 5.5 inch mark. So just like that. Okay. So that's the first placement that you want to make. Again, center mark here, 5.5 inches up from the bottom there. We're going to take our glue, and we are just going to put little tiny drops of glue. This is clear glue again. Tiny drops of glue here on each of the little corners. And then we are going to place that hexi right where we talked about. So again, you want your center, these points here to be right there along that center line, and the base point is that 5.5 inch mark. So this is our first one where we're going to base all of our measurements off of from here on out. Okay, so we're just gonna, we will press these in just a minute to set the glue, but as you move along, I want you to figure out the spacing that you want. I've decided that a little bit of extra spacing will get us further to the edges, but you don't want to go, you want to make sure that you've got a mark, let's say maybe 3/4 or so. That way you don't end up getting any in your seam. So just kind of give yourself a little guide mark there. Do not go past that mark. Again, that's 3/4 of an inch. Hang on, 3/4 of an inch from the edge there, just so that you don't get any hexes in your seam allowance. So just, again, give yourself a little mark there. But we're going to use this same method, and we're going to go all the way across with gluing these hexes in place. And again, we're using just a little tiny bit of glue. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the camera, get all my stuff placed, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about what your next step is. Okay, so now I've got my hexes glued on and then pressed in place. I am ready to go ahead and quilt both of these panels. So like I said, I'm doing identical front and back just so that the tote has a little bit more interest. But here's the way I'm going to quilt this. Now, obviously you can quilt it however you want to, but just keep in mind with that little bit of glue, you still have the potential to have these ends come up if you don't secure all the ends. So again, just keep that in mind. But here's how I'm going to go about my quilting. And this is what I was agonizing about over the last week, is because, like I said, I wanted to go all the way across the cover this way and all the way this way, and it just ends up being a geometric nightmare with that ruler creep. So what I'm going to do is just do straight lines every inch, which will catch all of these points. So it'll catch these points, you know, and then I'm going to go, you know, this way as well to catch these points. So I'm going to go straight every 1 inch all the way across the bag, okay, from top to bottom, and it's going to catch these points, okay. Then the next set of sewing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew here, and then I'm going to sew here, and it's going to catch this one, and this one, and basically just quilt the other directions on just these. So the only line that's going to go all the way across the bag is the one that goes straight, and then these diagonal lines are only going to go from here to, you know, the ends of that. So if you have a singular one here, then obviously you may have to just start and stop, just like we did with the Bible cover. But this will keep it from looking a little strange. So the next thing we're going to do, like I said, is just quilt the whole bag. I will do a very small tocking at the machine, and then the rest of it I'll just speed through, and we're going to quilt both the front and the back, and then we will come back here and work on the straps and the liner. Okay, so I'm at the machine and now I'm ready to sew on my hexes, and as I mentioned over at the table, I'm just going to do straight lines all the way down. And one thing I did forget to mention is that it might make it a little bit easier for you to make sure that your lines are all the way that they need to be if you take your hair marker and go ahead and mark the point to point here, so that way when you're going straight down you can catch all your points. So I am going to go ahead and just start quilting both of my panels here, and again we're just going to start from the top and then go all the way down to the bottom, and we're going to go all the way across, and then when we're done with that we are going to go diagonally to try to catch the diagonals of each of the angles of these hexes. So I'm going to go ahead and just let the camera run. I'm going to do my thing and I'll speed it up, and then we'll meet back over at the table once both panels have been quilted. Okay, now that we have both our front and back panels quilted, I just did them the exact same way. And if you can see here on the back, the way that I did it, like I said, I just did the triangles just this way and then just did the straight lines all the way up. But now we're going to set those aside and get started on the straps. So as I said, we're going to take our back quarter, square it up as best we can, so whatever length we end up with, it's probably about 20.5 inches, and then we're going to cut 2 3/4 inch strips. We're going to cut 3 of those. Now we're going to sew those together just like this. So we're going to put them right sides together, pin them, then we're going to sew right down here, trim off a 1/4 inch, and do that with all 3 of our straps, and it's going to give us one long piece of fabric. Then once we get that done, we're going to go ahead and sew our tube. So you're just going to take your pieces right sides together, and you're going to sew about 5/16 of an inch, which is 1/4 inch plus about 1/16 of an inch. That just makes it a little bit more snug when we put the straps in. So we're going to go ahead and sew one whole long tube, and then we're going to cut that tube in half and insert our straps. So we'll finish that up. I'll show you how to do that at the machine, and then we'll come back here and work on the liner. Now we're back at the machine, and we're going to sew our 3 little strips together. Now, one thing to note is I have put a matching thread in the top and the bottom thread, just because when we go to sew on the strap, we're going to top stitch, and we want to make sure that that matches. So we are just going to quite literally, and I did make a mark. I hope you noticed that I did make a mark for that diagonal. We are literally just going to sew down that diagonal, and I'm going to show you real quick what's going to happen, or actually what we've done. I'm sure a lot of you already know what we've done, so I apologize if this is just a repeat of what you already know, but you're left with this. And now we are just going to trim off 1/4 inch-ish from that seam line. And then when we open it up, we have one long strip of binding. So we're going to do that with both of the pieces, and then we're going to come back and sew the tube. Okay, now we have one big long strip of fabric. So this is one seam, and then here's another. We're just going to finger press it closed there, or open, and then we are just going to take our tube and we're going to put right sides together, and we're going to sew. So when I was talking at the table about 1/4 inch plus 1/16 of an inch, let me show you what I'm talking about. So this is 1/4 inch foot. So we're just going to drop our foot, and I'm going to show you. See how there's just a tiny bit of fabric left over on the side? The reason why I do this is because we're going to have a tube, and then we're going to insert a strap inside of it, and we want it to be nice and snug. So we're going to go ahead and just make it a little bit bigger than 1/4 inch. That way it makes that strap go in nice and snug. So we're just going to sew all the way down the side there. Okay, so now the tube has been sewn together, and it has netted us about 57 inches of the tube. So what we're going to do before we turn it inside out, we're going to go ahead and cut it in half, and that's just because it just, in my opinion, makes it just a little bit easier to handle. So we're just going to take both of our ends here, go all the way down to the other side, and just cut this in half. So nothing scientific, literally just take your scissors and cut it in half. And then we are going to take our tube turner, which in my case is a boba straw and a chopstick, and we're just going to turn it inside out. So the way that I do it is I just take my little boba straw, shove it down there at the end, usually about an inch or so down there if you can see, and then I just take my chopstick and push it through. So if you can see, the fabric is getting pulled through. Hang on, let's get to the end of the straw so that you can see what's going to happen. And there's my fabric. So then I just pull it inside out, and there's my tube. Okay, so we're going to do that with both of the tubes. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to insert those straps that we cut. Okay, so now I've threaded the strapping through the tube. It's in there. Hopefully you can see it. All I did is clip my bodkin at the end of the strap, and I pulled it through the tube here. And what we're going to do is we're going to trim the strapping that's inside to within about 1/2 inch of this edge. So the edge of my strapping is right here, and then we're just going to take the end and just push it in so we can kind of clean up this edge here. So if you have a stiletto, then just take your stiletto and kind of push push everything in. And yes, I do see that I have a little scraggly thread there, but we're just going to tuck that in. I will trim that scraggly thread here in just a second, but we're just going to tuck it into where it's nice and neat and clean. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to switch out to my edge stitch foot, which is a number 10 on the Bernina. And then I'm going to move my thread over to the left spot, about 5 paces, if you will. And you know what, actually, let me go ahead and take my stiletto, clean it up just a little bit more. I think it'll look a little bit neater if I tuck that down just a bit. And then we're going to just top stitch around the entire thing 1/8 of an inch. So with the edge stitch foot, it's going to help me get a nice clean edge. And I'm going to show you here in just a second what that's going to net me. So just guide it along this little guide here, and hopefully you can see how nice and neat and clean that is. And we're going to go all the way around the outside of the strap. You're going to tuck the other side of your strap in as well and just top stitch around the entire strap, and you're going to want to do that with both straps. Okay, so now we have our straps sewn and both ends are tucked in just like this, and we have a nice straight line due to using the edge stitch foot. We're going to set those aside for the moment. The next thing we need to do is trim our top and or front and back pieces to size. So I have gone ahead and trimmed them off camera. They're 17.5 inches wide by 19.5 inches tall. And I also went ahead and sewed together these half pieces that I talked to you about in the beginning, because this is our lining, and I've also trimmed them to the same size. So, okay, so now we've made our straps, and now it's time to attach them. So I have made a 1-inch mark from the edge there all the way up and all the way across. Hopefully you can see that. It's just light with chalk. And then what we're going to do is take the top of the bag. So this is the top, that's the bottom. I've made a mark right there at the halfway point, so the center point, and then 2.5 inches across each side, right here and here, and then 2 inches down. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to attach our straps. The inside of them is going to be right here, and then we're going to line that up with that 2-inch mark there. We're just going to clip them on. And I may have to do a little bit of adjustment when I get to my machine, because sometimes these shift a little bit, but we are going to go ahead and attach our straps with an X box. So I have shown you in other videos how to sew an X box, so I will go ahead and show you one more time today, but we are just going to take this over to the machine and we're going to sew a square, and starting here, and then we're going to sew an X, and this gives us a little extra support on our tote bag. So that would be the next step, is sewing on our straps. And then after we've sewn on our straps, then it's time to assemble the actual tote, or excuse me, to sew the tote and the liner together. I'm going to set those aside because I'm ready to go with those. I went ahead and sewed the 2 pieces of the liner together the way that I talked to you before. So these are right sides together, and they are also trimmed to the same size as the front and the back, and that would be 17.5 inches by 19.5 inches. And then we have just clipped them together. So we're going to take them over to the machine and we're going to sew a U shape. So leave the top unsewn and sew down the side, across the bottom, and across the other side. And you're going to want to do this with the liner and the tote once you get your straps sewn on. And once you get your straps sewn on, just make sure that your straps stay out of the way. I know that you won't be sewing across the top, but just kind of be mindful of them. But these will also go right side to right side, same thing, clip them together and then sew the U shape. So I'll catch you over at the machine and we'll talk about it over there. Now we're back at the machine and we're ready to sew on our straps. And we marked that 1-inch line right here, and now we're just going to use our edge stitch foot the way that I had it before, and I've also got the matching color thread like I had before. We're just going to start at that one corner and basically trace up over the same place as we went before, all the way till we get to that 1-inch line. And if your clips are in the way, then obviously you need to get them moved. And then we're going to turn right here and go down this side. Now just keep in mind your needle is on that mark, but your guide is a little bit over to the right, and that's because it's a 1/8 of an inch guide, so it's not going to sit right there on that piece. Let's go ahead and trim this out of the way just because I like it trimmed. And then we're just going to keep turning this. Let's get this clip out of the way. And we're going to go all the way down and all the way around the box, or all the way around that square basically, before we do the X. And You may do your X's a little bit differently. This is just the way that I've done it and the way that I like to do it. So again, if you choose to do it a little bit of a different way, then please do it however you're comfortable. Now we're going to take the whole thing and we're going to turn it at a diagonal. So we're going to do this to where your needle is angled to this point here. Okay, so again, don't pay attention to the guide, pay attention to the needle. So just watch the needle and make sure that it's going to land where you want it to, which is again right there in that corner. Okay, now because this side, and this side all have a double stitch, we're going to take this and turn it to where that top mark that we made with the chalk is going to get its second pass. So we're just going to go this way, right there in the corner. Then we're going to turn the whole thing around again and do the same thing to make the other X. Okay, so just angle your needle to where it's going to meet up at that corner, and there you are, a nice little X box. And this just adds some stability to your strap, keeps it on there nice and tight, nice and safe. So I'm now going to repeat this with the other one on this side and then the other two on the other side of the bag. We've got our straps sewn on, which are over here, and we have turned these pieces to face right sides together. Now it's time to sew them together in that U shape that we talked about. So we're going to do the same thing to the front and the back pieces as we are going to be doing to the front and back pieces of the liner. One thing that I completely forgot to mention is that when you're sewing your lining together on the bottom part of it, you want to leave about a 3 to 4 inch opening. So just make 2 little marks. That will be your start and stop, and then just back stitch on them, and then we're going to leave those open so that when we turn the bag inside out, we have a little opening to do that with. So I apologize for that. I will make sure that I make a note when I'm editing the video to make sure that you know to leave a space there. So now that we have the lining sewn together, and again, I apologize, I forgot to tell you to leave a good 3 to 4 inch opening here along the bottom. That's because when we attach these together, we do need to have an opening to pull it back out through. But now we have our lining sewn together, we have our front and back sewn together, and obviously we have our straps sewn in too. The next thing we want to do is box the corners. So when we were doing the measurements to place these, I said I was going to do a 3.5 inch boxed corner, but I think I might go ahead and do a 4 inch boxed corner just because this bag is pretty big. So I've just got a I've got a 6 inch square ruler, and I'm just going to hit that 4 inch mark. Actually, let's see if I can. So we're going to go 4 inches here, and then the 2 inch right there, because obviously this is 6 inches, and we're going to go ahead and make our marks. Now we're not doing this from the seam line. Some people tell you to do it from the seam line. I did account for that, so we're just going to do it from the edges of the bag. It does end up being about a 3.5 inch boxed corner because of the seam line, but anyway, we're going to go ahead and mark it at the 4 inches. Then we are just going to mark a square here, and we're going to go ahead and do that on all 4 corners. So the 2 corners of the front and the back, and then we're going to put the exact same measurement on the lining. And then what we're going to do is we're going to cut that out. Okay, so again, once you have your markings made, you're going to take your scissors, and I would recommend just a straight set of scissors. I don't know that I would use a rotary cutter because it can overcut. But anyway, you're going to cut out that square, and then we're going to box the bottom. So you're going to open it up just like this. And then you're going to take these 2 seams and you're going to make them opposite. Do you see how I did that? And we're going to clip this. And then using the exact same seam allowance that you use when you sewed your bag together, you're going to sew the corners. So do this to all 4 corners. Again, you're going to do 2 corners of the outside, 2 corners of the lining, and then we're going to sew those together, and then we'll come back in here and do the final assembly of the bag. And now we're at the machine and we're ready to box these corners. And like I said, you're going to want to use the same seam allowance that you used when you sewed your bag together. For me, I used a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I am just going to sew where I put all those clips, and then I'm just going to make these corners boxy. So one thing I do want to reiterate also is that you're going to want to backstitch just as a, you know, precaution, I guess. I think most of us are pretty used to back stitching in general, but do go ahead and make sure that you do a back stitch there. And we're just going to sew all 4 corners, so the 2 corners of the lining and then the 2 corners of the outer shell, and then I will meet you back at the table and we'll finish this up. So now we have boxed our corners. So we boxed our corners on the outside shell. We've also boxed the corners on the inside liner. So you're going to take the outside of it and turn it right side out, but you're going to leave the lining inside out. And here's what we're going to do. We're just going to take the outer bag and pull it inside the lining, okay? And what this does is puts right sides together. So you're going to take your straps, make sure that they're nice and tucked in there. And then you're going to match your seams and you're going to start clipping everything together so that we can sew it, okay? So you're just going to go all the way around, clipping the lining to the outer bag. And like I said, you want to make sure that your lines are, or not your lines, your edges here are close together. And we're just going to keep clipping, make sure that your handles are on the inside. And because there's a good inch right here, you shouldn't have any problem keeping them out of the way. And what I do like to do is go to the other seam, line that up too before I get too far, just so I can make sure that the seams, you know, if there's any kind of extra fabric in there, we can account for it. But anyway, you're just going to want to go ahead and clip all the way around this and then take this over to your machine and using the same seam allowance that you used before, sew these 2 pieces together. And then when you're done with that, you're going to take the whole bag and pull it through this bottom part here. And then we're going to turn it inside out and stitch a top stitch. Okay, so now we're back at the machine and we're ready to sew these 2 pieces together. And hopefully you can notice that I took my little tray table off of here so that I've exposed the arm, and the reason why I do that is because that way it makes it a little bit easier for us to get the bag in here. And then, like I mentioned before, we are just going to sew this with the same seam allowance that we used to do the lining, or to sew everything together, okay, which mine was about a 3/8 of an inch, and I say about because, you know, I did struggle a little bit there because I do have a camera literally right here, so sometimes it's a little hard to see, so my seam allowance got off just a bit. Anyhow, I'm still going to go ahead and use the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Hopefully I can get, you know, pretty even across here. But anyway, you're just going to keep going all the way around the top of the bag, and right here I've got a strap. Okay, so hopefully you can see that little bit of bulk. I have a strap there, so just go a little bit carefully when you go past that strap, just to make sure that it is out of the way. The last thing that we have to, or excuse me, one of the last things we have to do now is just turn the bag inside out. So you're going to take that little hole there on the bottom and you're just going to start pulling everything through. So I'm sorry, I get a little flustered when I'm trying to do this on camera because it's just, you know, I try to make my opening a little smaller just because I think it just makes it a little bit cleaner. But then that means that it's a little harder to get everything through. So hopefully we can get it through okay. Actually, that ended up being a whole lot easier than I thought it was going to be. Anyhow, so we're going to get this all turned inside out, and you're going to be left with this, which I know looks a little bit strange, but now what we're going to do is we're going to take this little opening here, and we are going to just do a little seam across there to seal it up, and then we're going to tuck the lining inside the bag. Hang on. Okay, so we're going to tuck the lining inside the bag. And then if you want to use your iron to flatten this out, or you can just take clips, you're going to want to get this, you know, kind of roll the edges as well as you can. And then you're going to want to take an 1/8 of an inch top stitch all the way around, and then your bag's going to be finished. And now I'm ready to seal up that opening in the bottom of the bag. And sometimes what I like to do is go all the way from the edge of that box corner all the way to the other. And that's just so that I don't end up having a little weird, you know, outer stitched part here. So I am going to go ahead and just sew all the way across the bottom. And I also have my edge stitch foot in. And the reason why I do is because when I go and do that top stitch, I'm going to use the edge stitch foot. So I figure I may as well put the edge stitch foot in right now and use it for this lining part. That way it's nice and even and straight. And like I said, I'm going all the way across the bottom. so that way it looks nice and uniform. I don't know that anyone's really going to look inside the bag, but if they do, it's going to look nice. So this is sewing up that bottom opening just like this, and then next we're going to do the top stitch across the top. So now we're ready to top stitch our bag, and I did go ahead and just use my iron, and it just made it nice and flat here. I don't know if you can see. It's a little bit easier to do than using the clips. However, you do it however you want to. Like I said, I've got my edge stitch foot in here, and we are quite literally just going to go around the entire top of the bag with a 1/8 of an inch stitch here, and then we will be all done. So I'm going to go a little bit carefully around the straps here, because I don't know if you can tell, my foot is a little bit wider than where that strap goes, so it's going to end up having to be kind of on top of the strap, so I want to go slow enough to where it doesn't catch it too bad and end up being too far off. And now we're good again. So now our shopper tote is complete, and I think that it came out super cute. I think that this is going to be super helpful for when I go shopping. It's also big enough for me to hold books and even my laptop. Now, if you decide that you don't want your boxed corners to be quite as big as mine are, we did a 4-inch boxed corner on here. You can always do a 2.5 inch to a 3-inch. I wouldn't recommend going lower than a 2.5 inch though. And then another thing that you can do to customize your bag is you can move the hexis up a little bit if you want to. You can make this a little shorter. There's all kinds of things that you can do to customize this and make it your own. So if you enjoyed this project, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and we will post new videos every Tuesday and Friday for you. So I hope that you guys have a great week, and I'll see you on Friday. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.